We're here for this session on a word that was probably breached for the first time in one of the Raisina dialogues a couple of years ago, how the whole India digital stack is now a digital public good. And you know, the similarities akin to digital public infrastructure is equivalent to physical infrastructure, whether it's roads, rails, waterways, whatever, electricity grid. So this is where it all started. We are very happy and delighted that we have a very diverse panel, which starts with Mr. Amitabh Kant, who's our G20 Sherpa from India, Mr. Andreas from OECD, who's the G20 Sherpa from OECD and a Director of Global Relations for OECD, Dr. Usta from Rwanda Governance Board, and Kizum from the UNDP. And if we can settle down, I know this is 6:30 or so, but 40 minutes, if you can settle down, we'll have an exciting discussion around digital public goods, digital public infrastructure, and what it means for development and societal growth. So without much ado, Mr. Kant, you've been the champion of digital public infrastructure that India has been building, the whole India model. Can you give us, in your views, the whole transformation and the role digital public infrastructure has played in this transformation story of India, and what are, how it is being received globally given our G20 presidency?
Arvind, if you look at the last 2.5 decades, all innovations, all technological breakthroughs have come from the big tech model of USA. So Google, Microsoft, Apple, Meta, and in the case of China, Tencent, Alibaba. They were able to do this because they took over citizens' data and then used AI and moved forward with a number of innovative solutions. Europe, represented by Andreas, came up with an alternative model of GPRD, and that they focused on privacy at the cost of innovation. India has done something very unique, unparalleled. It created the public infrastructure, which is owned by public or government, and on top of which we've allowed, these are the railway tracks on which we've allowed trains to run, which are the private sector owned, and there has been a huge amount of innovation. So these are open source, open APIs, interoperable models on which private sector is competing with each other. So India is the only country where PhonePe competes with Google Pay, WhatsApp competes with Paytm, and in fact 40 different payment apps are competing, and therefore I have not used my debit card, credit card for the last 4 years. I have not been to a physical bank, and I have not been to an ATM machine. My mobile is my virtual bank, and this was possible because we created digital identity for 1.4 billion people of India. Then, between 2015 to 2017, India opened up 480 million bank accounts. We embedded every bank account with both your digital identity and your mobile number. And therefore, between 2015 to 2017, 55% of the bank accounts opened across the world. That is, every second bank account opened in the world was opened in India. And today, India does 11x more payments, more fast payments than what USA and Europe do. It does 4x more digital payments than what China does. So fast payment is one story. During COVID, we were able to use COVID to give paperless digital vaccination to 2.2 billion people, that is 6x the population of USA and Europe. 2.2 billion people. My daughter, who lives in San Francisco, all her vaccination was on paper. And then we've created DigiLocker, where all your records are stored, your driving license, your insurance, everything. And because of this, we've done fast tags in education. We've done Swayam and Diksha and many other DPIs. But then, because we had done digital payments, you had young startups, unicorns, who use this cashless, paperless payment model, and looking at the credit history, they moved to do digital lending, which was paperless and cashless. So you had MobiQuick, Lending Card, Pine Labs, all unicorns now. They all did paperless lending. And then you had a set of new startups like Zerodha, Upstock. Imagine Zerodha holds 25% of the stock market of India. I mean, they got into wealth creation, which was paperless, cashless. And they reached out to people in Tier 2, Tier 3 city, rural areas. And then there was a new set of startups which started doing insurance. So you had Digit, Acco working on this and all doing 1 minute you get an insurance policy, which used to take 6 months. And you know, in India, when I was a young officer, I was working with traditional fishermen in Kerala. Opening their bank account was a nightmare. Know your customer was a nightmare. It used to take us 7-8 months. Today we do it in less than a minute. So the digital leapfrogging of India has been just enormous. And I think this is the model for the future. This model of open source, open API, and interoperable model pushes for innovation. It ensures privacy and it ensures data empowerment of the citizens. We have the Data Empowerment Protection Architecture, which ensures that the data is owned by the citizens, and that is what RBI is built on and use the account aggregator system to provide credit to the MSMEs. So it's a path-breaking model. Innovations come from the developed part of the world, but this is one innovation which has come. The DPIs are one innovation from emerging market which has overtaken the developed part of the world.
So, thank you, Mr. Kant. And as I say, nobody can tell this better than you, but you know, and I will just put my little bit 2 cents to it, that the cost of customer acquisition in India, whether it is for the telcos or the banks or the insurance companies, is the lowest in the world today, down from $25 to half a dollar, and that is enabled by the eKYC and the digital locker products that we have. And to summarize, you know, the tech for profit model that the Silicon Valley has had and the tech for surveillance that Shenzhen Valley has had. The third model is tech for regulation, which I'll ask you, Andres. And India's model is new data for development or technology for development. So I think that is well summarized, Mr. Kant. Andreas, obvious question to you. As I said, Europe has practiced technology for regulation. You find them a little bit here and there, and you're happy that you're doing some tech regulation. And I know, how do we see, how do you perceive this new model coming from India, especially with the constraints that you have with GDPR and others? And do you see Europe, EU learning from this, adapting to this as we go along?
Thanks so much, Arvind. First of all, I should probably say, how can you let me speak after this man here, which is always so passionate, so you can only lose speaking after him. But let me first say, I mean, the D in OECD stands for development, and I'm working as Director for Global Relations with more than 100 developing countries. I'm working very intensively with India's G20 presidency, with Amitabh Kant, on advancing in a partnership process joint solutions to this. So I'm not here to defend any European model or any US model. I'm here to look for ways how we can generate a framework, a global architecture for data-free flow with trust, for digital public infrastructure. And I actually think it's fantastic what India is doing here. And you know, it takes visionaries, entrepreneurs, pioneers like Gates or Steve Jobs on the private sector to change our lives. But it also takes visionaries like Amitabh Kant pioneers to change the mood in the public sector and to provide a digital public infrastructure. And I really want to highlight and welcome the personal leadership and the pioneership of Amitabh here. And it's something which we as OECD fully support, and we work together in the G20 to further advance India's priorities on this in the field of data for development, in the field of data free flow with trust. I want to give you maybe 3 hashtags in Twitter style staccato where I think we need to continue to work together. Hashtag number 1 is inclusiveness. We need to make sure that what we provide is open for everybody. In the pandemic, we saw that many of our systems in Europe or in all over the world are kind of prioritizing the urban areas and not so much the rural areas. So there is an urban-rural divide. There is also a divide between some rich and some poor. And for example, when we saw in this homeschooling, there were regions which were not so well connected with the internet, so the kids in these regions have less potential to access to schools. There is the question of who has an iPad, who is working on his old smartphone. So there are a number of questions in terms of inclusiveness we need to answer. Hashtag number 2 is trust and human-centric, and this is something I think you've done a lot of work in kind of creating for the vaccination a trustful system, which is a model for the rest of the world. And this brings me to the last hashtag. This is digital identity. And here again, India is leading by example with the identity card, with the credit card, with the digital credit card. I saw last week in Bengaluru the digital currency the RBI has presented. So again, fantastic, but we need to make sure that the systems we are creating there are interoperable. That's a difficult word, and I'm always kind of fall over it, but this time it was okay. So this is an important thing to do. So, and that's why we're sitting together in the G20, and that's why we as OECD, we also want to help and support that we come to a meaningful, let's say, global infrastructure where everybody can maybe drive with his own cars, with his own, some people may other vehicles, some people may come with their electronic vehicles, some other may use fossil fuel for a time, but this is what we're there for.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you very much. Kezum, can I go next with you? How do these digital public infrastructure that again India has championed so well converge with the developmental model of UNDP, and how can we take it forward?
Arvind, thank you so much for that question. It's a pleasure to be here from the United Nations Development Program with such an esteemed panel. Hello, Mr. Kant. We are in a time when digital is really systemic and fundamental. It's no longer just an enabler. And therefore, when we look at how it's changing the context of many countries, including development, we really need to consider digital from the point of view of the environment, climate, rights, inclusion, social protection, and so on. So, when Andreas, you spoke about, everyone can drive different cars, different vehicles, it's the common rails that they will drive on, which is where we really need collective action. And as the United Nations Development Program, we are part of this extraordinary moment to work with India and so many of our partners in India as well as globally. And we really see India very committed to an inclusive, rights-based approach to digital public infrastructure. And we think that those are almost centerpieces along with the technology that Mr. Kant had also explained, that these are centerpieces to how we design, implement, and ensure sovereignty, not just of countries, but of people, of users. Therefore, we think that the opportunity for DPI is now, because across development, we have endless stories, Arvind, of exclusion, of being left behind, and we're very, very far away actually from achieving our global goals, the SDGs that was launched in 2015 as sort of a interdependence cooperation framework. But I think we are also recognizing at the UN that our collective problem-solving mechanism is not matching the pace and scale of the challenges that we're seeing. And India's leadership, and with it the potential of the digital public infrastructure, has arrived with a great promise, whether it's the G20 and a number of other bilateral and multilateral conversations happening. We think that we need to focus on not our differences, but on the collective actions that we can take. Because, as I mentioned, DPIs are the deep plumbing that will allow countries to, communities and people to really sort of make high-speed connection with a greener, a more sustainable, and a more inclusive future for all, Arvind. But in that complexity, I think we need a cooperation framework that will enable countries to share reusable technologies as digital public goods. We need new administrative guides that rises above geopolitics to shape outcomes that benefit development outcomes, and that has the ability, the electrifying ability to ensure that government, the private sector, communities and people can really deepen cooperation and benefit from digital public infrastructure. So I think on the role of the UN, the task at hand is extraordinary. I think our Secretary General had spoken about how we need a UN 2.0 that can rise to the challenge, not just to have the right agenda, but also to have the mechanisms, the new strategies, the new programs that we need across 75 different countries that are at the moment building their digital public infrastructure. And so for us at UNDP, as we have worked in partnership to support the Ministry of Health in the implementation and the design of CoVIN around inclusion principles, we really look forward to ensuring that we can offer the UN and UNDP as a public platform to really amplify the development outcomes that can be accelerated by 2030.
Thank you, Kizum. And I have a second question for you, but that's in the second round. One of the things that everybody, the audience in the room would be interested to know is the whole genesis of the DPIs from India was to bring about governance reforms. And so the biggest user still actually lies the government. All our direct benefit transfer uses the jam trinity, which is the accounts, the bank accounts, the mobile connections, and the identity triangularized. But then we started using it for startups, as Mr. Kant talked about. The telcos have used it. The biggest telco rollout in 2016 by a private sector company was built on the whole eKYC that the Indian DPIs, the India stack offered. And of course the banks and fintechs use it. So apart from the government, it is the society at large, fintechs, banks, telcos that use it. But government still remains the largest user of DPIs, and it has saved the government. Today, more than 330 federal schemes, the money that gets transferred to the beneficiaries actually flows through the whole the jam trinity that I explained. And why I explain that is because, Dr. Ussa, the question is to you. You represent the Rwanda Governance Board, and we have used our top leadership led by our Prime Minister has really transformed governance in India. The 100 rupees that was famously transferred from the government coffers, and the World Bank used to say only 15 reaches the intended beneficiaries and 85 was lost in translation or with intermediaries, today is 0. That means 100 reaches the 100 people that are targeted to receive that money. So we have 0 lost in translation. That's the biggest governance reform. The same money is able to, feed to 6x more people, 7x more people. So, how do you see India's experience in doing this governance transformation and Africa's ambitions converging? And Africa is as diverse as India, even more. So, please share some thoughts with us on that.
Well, thank you very much. I also want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here and share. And I think coming from the question of diversity and governance and what the African continent can learn through this, I think the continent comes with a historical disadvantage for most of the other development aspects that we have seen. And the opportunity of digitization gives us the opportunity to leapfrog. We do not have to go back to the fax system. We do not have to go back to the systems that we are constructed many years before the continent had taken stock. So what the African continent needs to learn from India's experience is exactly what you said, being citizen-centric. I think digitization puts the human face in service delivery beyond the interaction of individuals, and I will address a few of the things that what we have seen digitization helping. First of all, as I said, it permits leapfrogging in a way that access to services do not need the traditional infrastructure. When we went through the vaccination programs in Rwanda, we had the data and all information put up through a digital system. And people only were able to go out for vaccinations, which allowed the security of the people, which allowed the terms and conditions in which we are in to be comfortable. So that brings also the element that the continent struggles with, which is corruption. And I think in terms, with the exact example that you gave, in terms of how much dies in the process, financing in the process, the opportunity of digitizing permits transparency, it permits accountability, and that is the actual definition of governance. Governance that is citizen-centric, that allows accountability, that allows transparency, and for Rwanda we add that permits efficiency. So with the digital infrastructure and its accessibility, efficiency is a core element in addressing some of the governance challenges that the continent is facing today. If you look, and we run a citizen report card every year at the Rwanda Governance Board, we've realized that most of the savings, the micro-saving schemes that exist, are quite much more at the mobile banking level, at the mobile money systems level than any traditional banks. So it means that we are able to introduce even mobile saving in a way that is conducive and friendly if people had to go out to find the banking infrastructure as it exists. So the digital system is probably the most relevant in governance, in areas of e-governance. More than 100 services, public services are now given digitally in Rwanda. Only 5 minutes you are able to get your child's birth certificate. And for public service delivery, you would know how much distance somebody has to make. And that is an economic transaction in itself, because if I don't have to make the distance and I'm able to use the digital infrastructure to be able to access the services, then my production levels will be much more. So the continent, and Rwanda in particular, have many things to learn from what India's experience has done in allowing our social protection systems transfers money directly to the citizens. But also the e-commerce, the small e-commerce, the women that do coffee production are able to access markets globally with minimum middle persons. You know, while that is an employment structure for the middlemen, it's also a deprivation from those who are directly into the production. So the diversity itself is not a negative element. I think the contextualization is a core element. For everyone, the digital infrastructure is a relevant infrastructure. But how do we contextualize them? What is the legal framework that permits all of us to enjoy that without discrimination? And how enabling that structure itself is probably the most important element. So to end, I think India's experience permits the continent the opportunity, but there is going to be one condition: the cost, the digital cost. You know, the digital cost is still very high on the continent. And while the benefits are great, I think what India is driving today in inclusiveness and accessibility and human-centric is really to make this digital public infrastructure less costly for the continent. Otherwise, it will become the same history of infrastructure, and the African continent will remain under-infrastructured in these structures. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And you've just, expanded on at least the two hashtags that Andreas gave us, human-centric and inclusion. So I'm going to ask this to Mr. Amitabh Kant. Sir, you've been the G20 Sherpa, you're already 4 or 5 months into the interactions, and one of your biggest tracks and discussion topics is the digital public goods, the data for development. How it is, and what we have been hearing over the last, not only just over this conference, but over any multilateral exchanges that we've been having, that everybody is amazed at what the scale and the diversity and the inclusiveness that India has brought about with this digital infrastructure. How is this being received by the other G20 plus nations? And how do we extend this technology, as Dr. Usa also said, in a trust-based manner to other countries?
So firstly, it's important to understand the challenge before the world. And the challenge is that in the world today, there are 4 billion people without a digital identity. There are 2.5 billion people who do not even have a bank account. There are 133 countries in the world which do not have a fast payment mechanism. And therefore, when India finds the solution for the 1.3 billion people of India, it is not finding a solution for India, it is finding a solution for the next 4.5 billion people who are going to move from poverty to middle class in the world. So this is a techno-legal solution of real-time lifting people above the poverty line across the world. And that is the big achievement of India. And it's important because I'm making this point because today you can't lift people above the poverty line and you can't do transformation without digital transformation. And digital transformation means that the ability to flow credit to people. We were able to do, during the COVID period, we were able to provide direct money into the bank account to 500 million people during the COVID period. When we started opening Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Bank Yojana, bank accounts, only 17% of the women in India had bank accounts. Today, 82% of the women in India have a bank account, and all of them say 82%. So what have you done? You've taken care of the people, the poorest of the poor during the COVID. You've done women-led development, you've ensured financial inclusion, and you've given huge amount of authority and power to the women because the bank accounts are opened in their name. And that is what you need to take across the world. So when you tell this story to the G20, and because you are also ensuring that the data remains with the citizens through the Data Empowerment Protection architecture, many countries say just replicate this model in their country. Say just take this model and replicate in this country. Now the challenge is twofold. One is when we did the bank accounts 2015 to 2017, 500 million bank accounts opened, there was huge political and administrative will coming from the Prime Minister of India. So whatever you do in any country, it requires a huge political and administrative will of that country. Number one, that's important. It can't be done. You can't create a great digital model and say, I'll translate it and put it in another country. I'll put it in a cloud, in a box, and put it there as but you need huge governance will in that particular, that's what I feel from the experience of India. India has been able to achieve this because of massive political will, and that is what is required in many other countries. And the second is our ability to put this as a great business model for Indian enterprises to take it across the world to population scale at low cost. Population scale at the lowest cost possible, because government officers like all of us will keep getting transferred, but the business enterprises must be able to do it on large scale across the world, and they'll be best equipped to do it.
Thank you very much, sir. Andreas, I'm going to come to you because what Mr. Kant just mentioned. You've seen financial systems being weaponized, technology being weaponized in the last 1.5 years. And you know the context that I'm saying. How to take the discussion further? While India is offering this to the world, countries are asking for it. How can we build trust into it, and how can countries think that this is co-creation rather than something that can be weaponized in the future?
Yes, that's a very, very good point. I think I need to go back to my hashtags in order to kind of make sure that we
Two of them have already been addressed by Dr. Utsa. I'm just kidding.
I have 3 new ones, okay? In order to make Amitabh's vision a reality. Hashtag number 1 would be, we are not yet there in terms of infrastructure. So we need to build the network so that everybody can take part in this process. Because I mean, you took a courageous decision with the digital identity, but you also invested in the networks, and you had made sure that everybody can take part. And your vaccination campaign is actually a fantastic example of what you can do with digital technologies. And this is a worldwide example. So I think the hashtag infrastructure inclusiveness is one of the most important, that the people believe in the vision that everybody can take part and that we do not create a digital divide. Second, and even if the word interoperability is difficult, and I really struggle to pronounce it every time, it's very, very important. This question about digital identity and how to make it interoperable with other systems across the borders, and that's why we are talking in the G20 and in other fora. I give you an example. When COVID struck us, I'm commuting between Berlin, Potsdam, Germany, and Paris, France. So I take a plane every Monday, come back every Friday. Suddenly, we got this COVID apps. So I had a German COVID app for Germany. I had a French COVID app for France. At one moment in time, there was a European app, which was already a progress. And then I went to the G20 meetings to Indonesia, so I had to download the Pendulungi Limpani app, which is the Indonesian app, and then I went to Switzerland and we had the Swiss app. So the question is how we make these systems, and this is possible, and I agree with Amitabh. We need to extend some of the good systems and have international agreement and have the framework for that. And last hashtag is the people and the systems. We need to take the people with us. I give you another example. This is my boarding pass from last week when I traveled from Bengaluru via Mumbai, via Munich to Berlin, back home from the finance ministers. I almost lost my flight in Mumbai because of this stamp. Because normally I travel like Amitabh with an electronic boarding pass, and I go just from one gate to the other. Not so in Mumbai. In Mumbai, they told me after I was standing in the fast track of, in a fast lane, 30 minutes, which is normal also in European airports, that you stand in fast lanes, 30 minutes. But they told me, no, you cannot go through. Even if they had this system for the electronic boarding pass, they told me you need a printed boarding pass. So I had to go to the Lufthansa counter, which was on the other end of the airport, 20 minutes. They gave me the boarding pass. I came back and they said, oh, now we can stamp the boarding pass. So you can go through. The whole thing cost me 45 minutes, and I had a layover of 1 hour 15 or so. So this is just an example. We need to make sure that we really use the thing and that we do not run two parallel systems. We do not run On the one hand, the digital system and the bureaucratic system. So this is my, because why on earth do you need to put a stamp on a boarding pass if you can do it electronically? So that's the point where I think we still have some work to go in order to really ensure that everybody trusts in the system and everybody takes part in the system.
Thank you, Andreas. And that is work in progress. Let me assure you that we have Digi Yatra coming up for international travel, and that will be solved by the next time you make that trip. It will be without any paper stamping. In fact, no need for a boarding pass also. You can just scan your face and go through the airport. You can try that at domestic and Delhi airport already. But I really come to that question to you, Kezum. Andreas talked about standards and interoperability, and I think this is a very big point. We have still not been able to agree on how to charge our phones uniformly across the world. Do you think we can achieve standards in terms of payments? 133 countries don't have a real-time payment system. Here there is a solution which does 8 billion transactions a month, almost 100 billion a year. 40% of the real-time payment systems happen in India. How do we, I mean, this is a standard available for us. How can we work with the United Nations to make this a global standard?
Arvind, great question. And as much as we have heard, from my co-panelists about the significant impact of the Indian digital public infrastructure approach, we have also seen when that similar approach has been applied in the state of Palestine, for example, or in the West African nation of Sierra Leone. The ability to pay 37,000 frontline health workers during the West Africa Ebola crisis who were going on strike, because they had not been receiving their promised danger pay. A common registry that was shared across government departments and development partners was really able to identify who to pay the right amount and through which sort of outlet. And then sort of the only two mobile companies at that point in the country plugging into a common infrastructure of distribution such as agents. Now obviously that's very rudimentary compared to the sort of significant kind of advances that the India digital public infrastructure has made. But the point that I'm trying to make is that for the United Nations, digital public infrastructure is not about a particular technology. It's about the interoperability of the technology. It's about its reusability that can really create climate data exchanges, sort of cross-border payment mechanisms. And therefore, Arvind, to your point, I think it remains an unanswered question, but a really important one that we should be answering very soon. And the UN is basically a collection of member states, our member states that represent almost all the world. And I think it's really important to recognize that so much of the development assistance in countries is really around sectors. There's almost no investments on the common goods layer that's really important. And this is where UNDP has been advocating for this agenda in the Global Digital Summit that's coming up, or the Global Digital Compact, as well as really seeing the need for that, because as Amitabh ji also recognized, digital public infrastructure is a whole of government approach, right? An ID ministry coming and learning here is not going to help you solve the political capital, the investments, and the planning that's required. And therefore, my sort of ask to the G20 countries, to the world as the United Nations, is to increase the investments in digital public infrastructure at the country level, to start off with 2 to 3 member teams that can really bring and work with that whole of government approach, the whole of society approach, and interact with the technologies, the resources, the learnings that are available around the world, especially in India.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kezum. Last question to you, Dr. Usa, and then we'll see if we have time for question answers from the audience. But, one of the big things, and not necessarily in the context of digital public infrastructure, is that cut and paste technology doesn't work. And I have lived far enough in Silicon Valley to say that, you know, they think from the top down. Africa is a vast continent. How can we bring in African diversity to ensure not cut and paste technology, but more inclusive technology that has been talked so much about by Andreas, by Kizum, by Mr. Amitabh Kant and everybody else. So, you know, how can that be utilized now to really make technology really inclusive and bottom up?
Well, thank you very much again. And I think the continent has itself shaped what it wants to look like. So we have the Agenda 2063 that reflects what the African continent and what kind of African we want to produce by 2063. And of course, we are part of the SDGs. And I think we all understand that SDGs is about partnership. And I think how we bring the diversity is that partnership actually happens in diversity. And therefore, we are able to understand and appreciate the differences. You know, in Rwanda, precision agriculture is key, given the landscape and character of that. And I think the truth is really about the population as well, in terms of looking at Africa in a great sense. But I want to highlight two key elements of how we bring the continent on board. First, digital literacy is still very low. And digital literacy is going to be informed by accessibility. So two challenges that can become an opportunity is the problem of digital literacy coupled with the absence of accessibility. In Rwanda, we are running a campaign called Connect Rwanda, and the intention is to give access to smartphones to as many people as you can. And I think we all know these smartphones, we learn on how to use them by owning them. So one of the things of crossing the diversity that exists on the continent is permitting access, giving us, allowing the continent to have the resources, the required resources in sharing these public goods, digital public goods, but also creating the knowledge, having the right knowledge, the right skills, and that will not be a top-down. That is what makes it citizen-centric. It will be responding to the actual challenges that the citizens have, and will build the right knowledge that people need to do to become part of the digital economy.
Thank you very much. I'm seeing Shubh telling us that we are just out of time. I had to, believe me, it's a tough job to take this stellar panel and contain within the 40 minutes I was allocated. So thank you very much to my co-panelists for making sure that we stuck to our time. And with that,